How you doing, Mosaic? Yeah? Good. I hope you're pumped. I hope you're on cloud 9 because we're talking about depression. We're going to squash that right out of you. No, in all seriousness, though, I should say, if you're a guest, my name's Aaron. I'm one of the pastors here, and we're really pumped that you're here. And honestly, I'm really excited to be starting the series we are starting this morning called The Dark Passenger. That's going to bring us right up to Easter on depression. And if you're hearing me say that and it's kind of like, well, this is new. I don't know that I've sat in church and talked about depression before. You're not alone in that. Me neither, which is really interesting. I kind of put out a feeler on Facebook and Twitter about a month ago or so, and I said, hey, we're thinking about doing this series on depression, and I'd love to be able to share from people who struggle with depression some of their journey and what it's like, and if you'd be willing to share, hit me up. You know, and that post blew up, and I got a lot of public messages and a lot more private messages, and I was really pretty overwhelmed by the number of people saying, this is my struggle. And I would run into people in restaurants and coffee shops, and some of them not even a part of Mosaic, but saw the post, and they'd say, hey, you know, if I'd be willing to share, this is my struggle. And even yesterday, one of my neighbors saw me outside, and we connected, and he said, hey, this is my struggle. And so it's been pretty interesting and a little bit overwhelming, and so I did what I normally do. When I'm getting ready to approach a series, I love to see what other churches have done and how they've approached the topic, for better, for worse. Sometimes I learn a lot about how I don't want to approach the topic from other churches. But I started searching around, and honestly, it was kind of dumbfounding. I couldn't find hardly anything from churches talking about depression, anxiety. And here's why this is really surprising, just to throw some numbers at you and kind of give you a picture for how big of a thing this really is. In 2010, more than 253 million prescriptions were written for antidepressants in the U.S. 253 million. To put that in context, the total population of the U.S. is about 311 million. All right, it's a big deal. When it comes to medications in the U.S., antidepressants have become the second highest volume drug in the country, second only to some cholesterol medications. In fact, in 2010 alone, Americans spent $11.6 billion on antidepressants. And all that to say, even though for how much antidepressant medication that we do consume as a nation, still every year 34,000 people choose to take their life. And that's about 94 a day, one suicide every 15 minutes. And for each person who succeeds in taking their life, there's at least another 100 who try and don't succeed. It's a really big deal. It's the third leading cause of death among teenagers, and it is the number one cause of violent deaths globally, is suicide. And so I share that because this is a really big deal, and it's very interesting that the church doesn't often talk about this. And because we don't talk about this, I think there's a lot of confusion in the way that we talk about mental health in general, and a lot of assumptions. And when we misunderstand and we mistreat the issue, sometimes we make it a whole lot worse. And to be completely fair, just so you know, I don't want to throw other churches under the bus by any means. I think a big part of it is, as a pastor, like, I was never prepped for this, you know? I've got a couple degrees in Christian ministry and pastoral ministry specifically, and we didn't talk about this. I wasn't trained in how to deal with this and talk about this. We didn't talk about it in undergrad or seminary, and so I think for a lot of pastors, we're flying blind on this one, and we didn't have churches or institutions who modeled for us how to engage it or taught us how to engage it. So the reason that we're talking about this, a big part of the reason, is not because Mosaic is ahead of the curve and awesome. Now, we might be that, but that's not the reason we're talking about it. Really, one of the primary reasons we're talking about it is because, for my own part, this is not an issue that I have the luxury of ignoring, because depression and anxiety is something that I struggle with. And it's something that I've struggled with for as long as I could remember. Looking back, even as a young kid, there were seasons of very deep depression. And I grew up in a church where we didn't talk about it. In fact, there was kind of this stigma around mental health issues, and specifically depression and anxiety, where anybody who was kind of melancholy and sad, like, just didn't get it yet. You know what I mean? Because to be a good Christian was to rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice, you know? Like, if you're happy to know it, we clapped our hands. And we would sing songs that reflected kind of this assumption, you know? So we would sing, what was another one? Oh, I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart, right? Where? Right? Down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. I've got the, you know, and then you get in the chorus, and I'm so happy. So very happy. I've got the love of Jesus in my heart, you know? And for kids that struggle, and young people and adults who struggle with melancholy and go through seasons of depression or clinical depression, anxiety, less true words cannot be spoken and sung about. Right? They didn't have like lament psalm versions for us. There weren't lament songs we sang for obvious reasons. You know, they're not as marketable. I've got the pain, 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 pain down in my heart, and I'm so depressed, so very depressed. Not as marketable. We didn't have songs like that. But it did create in me a lot of confusion. And when I became a Christian, like, the depression, anxiety didn't go away. And when I became a pastor, it definitely did not go away either. And there have been a number of times in my journey, before marriage, after marriage, before ministry, after ministry, where I've struggled with this. And if I'm being entirely vulnerable this morning and honest with you, a good chunk of 2014 was in and out of a lot of depression, it was a rough season, 2014. And right now, maybe it's one of the worst that I can remember, where I'm at right now. And I thought about waiting to address this issue until I was out of it, right? And so, like, I've got a break coming up this summer. I'm surrounded by a loving directional team who they say they suggested, but they really just lovingly commanded me to take a break this summer to rest and get well. And so I thought about, you know, maybe this fall when I'm out of the darkness and I'm out of the fog talking about it. And then as I thought about it and prayed about it, I thought, you know what, that's what we always freaking do in the church. You know, it's like we don't talk about issues till they're not issues anymore, you know? And so it's like, you know, it's like I used to struggle with this, but now I'm victorious. And Jesus, here's 3 steps to be like me, the person who doesn't struggle anymore, you know? And as I thought and prayed about that, I was like, you know what? No, I'm not going to do that. You know, and maybe, just maybe, you know, in the midst of it, this might be more real and more encouraging to those who don't see an end to the fog. So that's what I'm praying for, and that's what we're going to do. And I think this is really important and really relevant to all of us, whether you struggle with depression, anxiety, or not. Because when we misunderstand and we mistreat this issue and mental health issues in general, but for our purposes this morning, this issue, we make it worse. And you got to know that there are people in your life right now who are struggling and you may not know it. And if there aren't many in your immediate circle right now, there will be. And if it's not your pastor, right, it might be your friend, your neighbor, right, the person in your small group, the person sitting next to you right now. It could be your spouse, it could be your kid. But there will be those. And so understanding this is really important for all of us. And so this morning, what I want to do is talk about depression, anxiety, and how it affects those of us who do struggle with it. And we're going to talk about a few different ways that happens. And next week, we're going to get more into causes and cures and what those of us who struggle with depression and anxiety wish you understood about it and how you can love us well when we're in those seasons. But this morning, I just want to really talk about the struggle itself. So to begin with, how it feels, which brings us to our title, how it feels. One of the ways that depression and anxiety kind of feels like is a dark passenger. Any Dexter fans in the house? Yes. So you knew it, right? As soon as you started, like, it's Dexter. So Dexter is, if you know, it's a show. It's not on anymore, which Megan and I mourn often. And it's about a sociopath who kills other sociopaths. So he's a serial killer who only kills other serial killers. And, I'll leave it to you to connect the dots about what that suggests about your pastor's character. that he loves this show shamelessly, but we do. But there's this thing that Dexter talks about. You know, he went through a very traumatic experience as a child that watching his mom murdered, dismembered, and then he as a young boy was left in this storage container in the midst of all of her blood until police found him. Very dark show, this Dexter. One of the reasons I probably like it. But it affects the way that he copes and interacts with people and with the world, and he has in him this insatiable desire to kill. And he calls it this dark passenger. And there's seasons when he manages it better than others. There's seasons when it's stronger than others, and sometimes he gets along pretty well, but it's always kind of there, this dark passenger. Another way to think about it, any Lost fans in the house? Remember Lost? Yeah, some of you? We also loved Lost. It's kind of like the black smoke monster in Lost, you know, if you remember that, which is actually kind of how Charles Spurgeon described depression. And it's kind of like this ominous presence, and you don't really know when it's going to like creep up and like snatch you and drag you underground, you know, but it's always there. It's always kind of around and near and within you, this dark passenger. David Foster Wallace wrote this. He was a person who struggled a lot with depression. He called it the bad thing. And this is how he described it. He said, because the bad thing, depression, not only attacks you and makes you feel bad and puts you out of commission, it especially attacks and makes you feel bad and puts out of commission precisely those things that are necessary in order for you to fight the bad thing, to maybe get better, to stay alive. This is hard to understand, but it's really true. Imagine a really painful disease that attacked your legs and your throat and resulted in a really bad pain and paralysis and all-around agony in those areas. The disease would be bad enough, obviously. But the disease would also be open-ended. You wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Right? Your legs would be all paralyzed and would hurt like hell, but you wouldn't be able to run for help for those poor legs, just exactly because your legs would be too sick for you to run anywhere at all. Your throat would burn like crazy, and you think it was just going to explode, but you wouldn't be able to call out to any doctors or anyone for help precisely because your throat would be too sick for you to do so. This is the way the bad thing works. It is especially good at attacking your defense mechanisms. Right, the way to fight against or get away from the bad thing is clearly just to think differently, right? To reason and argue with yourself, just to change the way you're perceiving and sensing and processing stuff. But you need your mind to do this, right? Your brain cells with their atoms and your mental powers and all that, yourself. And that's exactly what the bad thing has made too sick to work right. And it's a little bit unnerving and heavy even to read David Foster Wallace, because he did struggle with depression and anxiety, and about 10 years ago he took his life. And so this is something that's very, very real. And one of the things I love about what he's saying here is he's kind of getting to the heart of, you know, for those of us who struggle with depression and anxiety, one of the wrestling sometimes is like, you know, do I make bad decisions because I'm depressed, or am I depressed because I make bad decisions? And he's kind of saying like, yes, exactly, you know? And so for me, you know, it's like, you know, are you depressed because you have been laying in bed all night listening to Sarah McLachlan and eating an entire box of Thin Mints, you know? Are you depressed because of that? Or are you depressed because you just spent all night listening to Sarah McLachlan, consuming 4,000 calories and just watching You've Got Mail for the third time this week, right? And he'd say, yes, yes, you're depressed. It's kind of like, you know, Fat Bastard in Austin Powers, right? All right, I eat because I'm unhappy, and I'm unhappy because I eat. It's a vicious cycle, right? He's saying both. It's both, right? It's just always, it's always there. Another way that it often feels like is like a broken heart. Right, C.S. Lewis says this. He says, you know, mental pain is less dramatic than physical pain, but it's more common and it's also more hard to bear. The frequent attempt to conceal mental pain, it increases the burden. But we do this really well, right? You know, there's some of you in this room and you are in a rough place right now and nobody knows, do they? Because we can fake it, especially for an hour and a half on Sunday morning, right? We might need to take a nap, but we can pull that off, right? And so for some of you, you're there and there are people who are really close to you and they have no idea how depressed and anxious and lonely you feel right now. You feel like that. Just exactly like that. And they have no idea. C.S. Lewis continues. He says, you know, it's easier to say my tooth is aching than to say my heart is broken. Right? To say my heart is broken suggests weakness, right? And it's different. You know, when my tooth is aching, I can go to a dentist and we can actually put it on the x-ray and see the problem. He can diagnose it, identify it, and fix it. But when it comes to emotional pain, it doesn't work that way, right? Right, so we treat it oftentimes differently, right? If I break my leg and I refuse to go to the doctor, I know some of you well enough to know you will tackle me if you have to and take me to the hospital, right? And I love you for that. I need friends like that, right? But we don't treat emotional pain the same way, right? What will we do if in our church we have people like David, who's saying things like this in Psalm 6? Have mercy on me, Lord, for I am faint. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are in agony. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord? How long? Right? I'm worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with my tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of all my foes. Right? We have somebody like that in our church. What do we say? You know? What's wrong with that person? What a drama queen. Whose bad idea was it to put him in charge? You know, I don't think he's qualified to lead. It's God's idea, by the way. Right? What in the world? Clearly he doesn't have enough faith. Does he even trust God at all? All right, but what does God say about that man? He says, that is a man after my own heart. All right, and sometimes it feels like that heart is bleeding out. Often feels like a broken heart. A third way to think about it in the way that it often feels is, and I really like this picture, it feels like a bruise in your mind. Right? Jeffrey Eugenides writes this in The Marriage Plot, and this is what he says about depression through one of his characters. And this gal is at an AA meeting. She's a crack addict, and this is what she shares. One thing I learned between addiction and depression a lot worse. Depression ain't something you just get off of. You can't get clean from depression. Depression be like a bruise that never goes away, a bruise in your mind. You just got to be careful not to touch where it hurts. It'll always be there, though. Right, I love this picture of depression, anxiety being like a bruise in your mind, because the thing about bruises is like sometimes you know where they came from and sometimes you don't. You know, and so like not all that long ago I was putting our kids into our minivan, which may be part of the cause of my depression at times is a man in his minivan. But I was putting them in the van, and I wasn't really paying attention, and I opened the sliding door, and it hit me like in the knee, you know, and I bruised up pretty good. And for me, like I knew right where that bruise came from, you know, and depression can be that way. So one of my first really deep bouts with depression was in between my 7th and 8th grade year, and we moved from Worthington, Minnesota to Alexandria, Minnesota, left all of my friends, the only life and place I'd ever known, to this small kind of tight-knit Scandinavian community with a lot of money, resort community, and our family didn't have a lot of money. When we show up, didn't know anybody, I missed my friends, I was bullied, very much alone, and I spiraled into very deep depression and was suicidal for a while. And for me, like I knew precisely where that depression came from. And for a number of us, we do experience depression that is brought on by life events, right? Circumstantial, experiential depression, where something happens, a relationship falls through, right? We lose a job, we lose a loved one. Something happens and we become depressed, and we can point our finger at it and we know it. But sometimes the thing about bruises is sometimes you get a bruise and you're like, where'd that come from? You know, you wake up and you're like, what happened to my leg? Megan, what did you do to me while I was sleeping? Because I didn't have this when I went to bed. And depression can be the same way. And honestly, for me, in my own experience, like this is often even harder. And I say that as somebody who hasn't lost a close loved one, so I don't know what that is like. But for me, it's been harder when I don't know where it came from. You know, and so like the season that I'm in right now, and that I've been in for a lot of 2014. You know, it's harder because it's like it doesn't make sense. You know, like I look around, I'm like, I love my church. Like I get to do this, you know? Like I love my wife. Like we have a really great marriage. I love my kids most of the time. I love my kids. And like they're beautiful and they're healthy and they're relatively well behaved. What is wrong with me? But the bruise is just there. It's just there. And sometimes depression and anxiety is that way. You know, and the thing about bruises is you can't just like stick an ice pack on it and then just it magically goes away. Like it takes time and it takes care. You know, and in fact, if you ignore it and you just kind of push through it and pretend like it's not there, for those of you who ever played sports, if you ever tried to do that, you learn what I learned, and that is that if you don't care for that, it gets worse. And what is a very small injury to begin with can actually become very serious. And depression often works the same way. So I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about how it affects the way that you feel, those of us who struggle with it. First of all, sadness. Oftentimes, for those of us who struggle with it, there is just this overwhelming sadness, and sometimes seemingly for no good reason at all. And we get a really great picture of this in Psalm 42. And this is what it says. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When can I go and meet God? Right? My tears have been my food day and night. While people say to me all day long, where's your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul. How I used to go to the house of God under the protection of the Mighty One, and shouts of joy and praise among the festive throng. Right? But now, why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God. He's like preaching to his own soul. He's like, put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God. My soul is downcast within me. Therefore, I will remember you from the land of the Jordan, heights of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep in the roar of your waterfalls. All your waves and breakers have swept over me. Right? He feels like he's drowning. By day the Lord directs his love. At night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. And I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Right? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? My bones suffer mortal agony as my foes taunt me, saying to me all day long, where's your God? Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God. Right? He's deeply sad, talks about his tears being his food day and night, and he's lost and he's confused and he doesn't really know why. Right? Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why do I feel this way? And this is often an experience for those of us who struggle with it. And so you feel this sadness, and oftentimes when it's happening is you find yourself drawn to sad things, you know, and so you can tell I'm in trouble when I'm listening to like a lot of Alice in Chains, you know, and a lot of Tool and these kinds of things. You know, I remember going up to the Twin Cities and I was staying with a couple of old friends during a seminary weekend, and a lot of my seminary friends were off doing their own thing, so I was, you know, they weren't going to be there. So I was getting food from Target up there, and I grabbed a couple of movies for me to watch in the evenings, and I grabbed Lost in Translation and Reign Over Me. And if you know those movies, they're depressing movies, you know? Like Lost in Translation, like Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson are like just alone in Tokyo and lost, and they're just wandering through life, and they kind of have an emotional affair, and they're just totally depressed and just wandering. The only redemptive part is they're wandering, lost, hurting, depressed, like together, you know? Very depressing. And then the other one, Reign Over Me, is about this guy who loses his wife and kids in the 9/11 thing, and he goes crazy. And he's trying to deal with the trauma of losing his entire family and being alone and going nuts. And so I get to my friend's house and you know, checking in with them, and Amelia's like, what's that? I was like, oh, just a couple movies I picked up to watch later. And she's like, those are a couple interesting movie choices, you know, which brought me some shame. And, you know, and I just said, yeah, you know. And in the moment, I was just thankful she didn't like say, so your plan is to come home from class and to watch those alone. Yeah, you know. But that's oftentimes what happens. You're drawn to sad things for reasons you can't really understand. And my in-laws know this about me. So recently we were at, I think we were at Applebee's, which doesn't help with the depression going to Applebee's, but we were but we were at Applebee's, and they were talking about this movie, and they're like, oh, it was so depressing, we hated it. But Aaron, you'd probably love it. You know, it's like, thanks for that. Yeah. You know, but that's oftentimes the way that it works. You just have this overwhelming sense of sadness, and you're drawn to sad things, and you don't really know why. A second common feeling is anger. And it's not so much what you, like powder keg anger, where you're just like visceral on people and you're just exploding on people. It's more like what you might call like a crock pot anger. It's underneath the surface and just kind of simmering there all the time. Some of the things that I've read, the way that's often described with depression, anxiety, it's like anger turned inward, right? And so things happen, or you're just disappointed with how life has gone, or maybe something didn't happen, but you're angry. And rather than projecting that on other people and blaming other people, it's an anger that turns inward, and it's just kind of always there. A good example of this in the Bible is Jonah. And Jonah is just ticked. He's so angry at God's call in his life. And then God starts using him to save people that he hates, and then he's angry about that. And he gets so mad, and then he's exhausted and he's mad about that, and God gives him some shade, and then the shade goes away, and then he's mad about that. He's just like this, and then he says this. He actually says this. He says, God keeps coming to him and being like, should you really be angry about this? And he's like, yes. And eventually he just says, I'm so angry I wish I were dead. It's awesome. It's a Bible. It's good. There's some really good stuff in there. But a really good TV show character that represents this well. Any Breaking Bad fans in the house? Breaking Bad? Yeah. So I haven't seen the whole series, which I'm constantly reminded that I need to. I will, okay? But Walter Wright, is a great example of this. He had this picture of what his life would become and where he would go. He's this chemistry teacher, but then he gets sick and he becomes a meth dealer to make ends meet. And you watch it transform his character, and there's constantly this kind of simmering just beneath the surface anger. And you follow the story and you watch it really begin to destroy his life and to change who he is. And oftentimes people who suffer from depression, anxiety, there is just this kind of under the ground anger that's there. Another one is worthlessness. Is often a staple of depression, anxiety. Connected to this is kind of this lie, this idea that people can't really like you, right? Anytime they say something kind to you, a compliment, there's this, your mind goes this place, you just assume that, well, there's an agenda attached to that, right? Because I can't really be loved or be liked because I feel worthless, right? So any Good Will Hunting fans in the house? Good Will Hunting? Yes, my favorite movie. Oh, my people. My favorite movie, Good Will Hunting. And there's a scene where Will is with his girlfriend, Skylar, and she asks him to move to California with him because she loves him, and she really wants to take this relationship seriously. And Will simply cannot believe that she loves him, right? And you watch him, his character, he does not believe that he's lovable. And so everything kind of gets deflected because he just feels so incredibly worthless. And there's characters in the Bible that really wrestle with this. So Jeremiah is a great example. Jeremiah is used by God in some incredible ways, but we find him struggling with anxiety, depression, and feelings of worthlessness. In fact, he says this in Jeremiah 20. He says, "Cursed be the day I was born, right? May the day my mother bore me not be blessed. Cursed be the man." This is great. "Cursed be the man who brought my father the news, who made him very glad, saying, a child was born you a son." Right? May that man be like the towns of the Lord overthrew without pity. Right? The poor guy, he was just announcing that a baby was born, but he's so just distraught. He's like, "May he hear wailing in the morning, a battle cry at noon, for he did not kill me in the womb. With my mother as my grave, her womb enlarged forever. Why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow and to end my days in shame?" Right? He feels like his life has no worth. And he just says over and over, it's better that had I not been born, because my life is without value. I'm worthless. Another one, common experience for those of us who struggle with depression and anxiety, is a feeling of hopelessness. This feeling that not only are things not going to get better, but oftentimes that they're just going to get worse. There's no hope for the future. Anybody see August Osage County by chance? Yeah. Well-written, dark movie, depressing movie in many ways. And Julia Roberts' character says something in the film, and she says this. She says, "Thank God we can't tell the future, for we'd never get out of bed." Right? Which is just this hopeless thing to say, right? If we knew it was coming on the horizon, we would just stay in bed forever, because it's going to be that bad. Just this sense of hopelessness. Another one that often accompanies depression and anxiety is that of panic, right? And so this morning you're hearing me say depression and anxiety with my language, something that the medical community is doing more and more. Because what we're understanding is they're very closely connected. And in fact, in many ways, depression and anxiety are kind of two sides of the same coin. They often go together. And when you struggle with the anxiety side of depression, panic is a feeling you grow pretty accustomed to. And I'll say for me and my struggle with depression and anxiety, the anxiety piece has really become a battle. And about a year ago, I had my first panic attack. And before I ever had a panic attack, I think I always thought, like, what an exaggeration, you know what I mean? Like, what an overreaction. That person is clearly weak, emotionally. And I was driving just across Lincoln, and I felt like I was having a heart attack. And I don't know that there was any other time in my life where I thought I was going to die, but that's right. That's what I thought. I really thought, like, my life, I'm going out right now. And I pulled the car over, and my first thought was, Megan, I'm so sorry. And crap, my kids are not going to have a dad, Stupid allergies. We need to clean this place. But I sat there for about 15 minutes just like talking myself off the cliff, just like, what in the world is going on with me? And it kind of felt like my heart felt like a hummingbird on steroids, like it was just going to explode out of my chest. And that's what panic feels like. And oftentimes it's very, very irrational. Like it doesn't make sense. Chris Williams, Paul Richards, and Ingrid Witten wrote a book called I'm Not Supposed to Feel Like This. And in it, they write this about this anxiety piece. And they said, in anxiety, the person often overestimates the threat or danger they're facing, and at the same time, they usually underestimate their own capacity to cope with the problem. In other words, it's an irrational panic, and those of us who struggle with it, we know it. So this week is the worst week I can remember with this, and I don't know what that is, but why it was this week, I don't know if it's just because I'm sitting in this stuff, but Thursday night, like I wake up just in a panic, and I can't sleep, and the next morning, what I'm thinking about and worried about is in the morning, I've got to get up and get the kids off to school. And those of you who are stay-at-home moms are like, wow, small fries. That's nothing. Anybody can do that. Try my life, I know. I do this every week. It's not even a new part of my routine. Every Friday morning, that's just what I do. But I'm overwhelmed with panic. It makes absolutely no sense, and I know it doesn't make sense. Last night I'm hanging out with Megan, and all of a sudden, like, I just get hit with this, like, wave of panic, and my heart starts, like, beating out of my chest, and I'm like, I have to go lay down. I'm like, what is happening to me? And for those of us who struggle with it, it does not make sense, but it's just like all of a sudden, boom, there it is. Just like jumps on you, this feeling of panic. And then lastly, one of the things that can often happen is feeling suicidal. This is from one of the people here in our community who shared with me. Said, I started hurting myself when I was 12. I would scratch at myself with a piece of broken glass, cut myself with a razor, or burn myself with a lighter. I hid my scars under my sleeves. They were my secret. I wanted to destroy myself. And gone unchecked, depression can lead to this place. And this is what Charles Spurgeon wrote. He said, death would be welcome as a relief to those whose depressed spirits make their existence a living death. Are good men and women ever permitted to suffer this? Indeed they are. And some of them are even all their lifetime subject to bondage, feeling as if even God himself had quite forgotten them. It can feel this way. And, I've been a part of conversations like this. I think I've probably said these words. I've certainly heard them said. But I think for those of us who don't struggle with depression, anxiety, there can be this temptation to, say things like, depression or suicide is just selfish. Just so selfish, and it doesn't make sense. So selfish, and And there's this sense that, yes, it is. But you're right in saying, like, you don't understand. And until you've walked in those shoes of depression, anxiety, you can't understand. Right? To walk in those shoes that are so heavy and submerged in despair and hopelessness and pain, and to think that the only way out is death. Right? And when you're in that place too, when it's affecting the way that you think and you feel really legitimately that I can't be loved, like nobody's kind words are genuine, it's all with an agenda because I'm worthless, my life is worthless, then it's not that big of a hop, skip, and a jump to start to think that death is the answer. And for those of you who are there, just first of all, if you're there, let somebody know. Right? Let me know. You won't find judgment from me. I've been there. But don't go after that alone. Don't walk in that alone. Let somebody know. And just so you know, like suicidal thoughts, just so you know, like this too is not something that is foreign to this book. Right? We find godly men and women, heroes of the faith, celebrated as heroes of the faith, struggling with suicidal thoughts at times. Right? In fact, listen to this. This is from the prophet Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 3 and 4. He says this. It says, Elijah was afraid and he ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness alone. And then he came to a broom bush and he sat down under it and he prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. Right? Elijah wanted to end his life. He's overwhelmed with anxiety. He's overwhelmed with the depression. And he can't see a way forward. He just wants it to be done. And just so you know, right, if you're there, if you're ever there, if you're walking with somebody who is there, just so you know, in this moment, what God does not do is say, will you get your crap together? Right? Do you remember that I chose you, Mr. Prophet? Right? How do you not trust me yet? Do you remember what we just did, like defeating all the prophets, right? Lightning from heaven, that was me, I'm on your side, and now you want to die? He doesn't beat him up. He doesn't shame him. Right? In this moment, God meets him with tender grace. He can handle your despair. He can handle your unedited prayers and your cussing him out and wanting to die. And you will be met each and every time with tender grace, because that is what God is like, for the record. So I want to transition now to not just how it affects the way we feel, but how it affects the way that we think, for those of us who struggle with depression and anxiety. Somebody from this community shared this with me. You know, for me, having depression and anxiety was such an isolating time. I felt like I was being pulled into a dark hole. Right? I thought thoughts that were completely out of my control. Right? And depression and anxiety often has a huge effect on the way that a person thinks. Right? One of the ways is in extremes. Right? And so everything has to be exactly right or it's completely wrong. Either you need to be a complete success or you are an utter failure, but there's nothing in between. Right? And so oftentimes you're given to thinking in extremes, right? And so, you know, another word for this might be perfectionism. Right? But it's not just perfectionism, right? It's perfectionism that's being influenced, sometimes induced by depression and anxiety, and it's very, very intense. And I will tell you, for me, this is a huge part of my struggle. Huge part. And it can be very paralyzing. Anne Lamott, any Anne Lamott fans in here by chance? Oh, you guys, you're missing out. Anne Lamott is an author. She is phenomenal and painfully just honest. She's just great. And in a book that's actually about writing called Bird by Bird, she talks about this struggle with perfectionism. And this is what she says, this kind of extreme thinking. And she says, I think perfectionism is based on the obsessive belief that if you run carefully enough, hitting each stepping stone just right, you won't have to die. But the truth is that you will die anyway. And that a lot of people who aren't even looking at their feet are going to do it a whole lot better than you and have a whole lot more fun doing it, which is so good. Brennan Manning, one of my favorite all-time authors, he used to talk about one of his good friends in New Orleans, and she would constantly be saying to him and to others, and referring to perfectionists as the people who are constantly shoulding all over the place, and so she would say things like, don't you dare bring that should over here. Right? Brennan, don't you dare should on me. Right? You keep all that should to yourself. Right? And for those of us who struggle with thinking in extremes as part of our depression anxiety, we don't need other people to should on us because we should all over ourselves all the time. Right? And it's just like this constantly like I should do this and I should do that and I shouldn't do this and I shouldn't do that and I shouldn't have done that and I should not go do this, and it's just should. And the thing is, right, when you're thinking that way, everything is either black or white. There's not very much gray. Everything is black or white. And when you're depressed, what do you think you see a whole lot more of? Right, a whole lot more black. A whole lot more dark. Right, you miss the redeemable good things because you're just in that dark place and you're thinking in extremes. Another way that it affects the way we think is through what you might call a false filter. So Ed Welch has written a little bit on this online. He wrote a piece called Depression's Odd Filter. And he talks about this filter that we often have, and everything that we hear gets put through this depression filter. And he says this. He says it's like this. All right, someone says to you, I love you, but you hear nothing. Well, actually, you hear something. You hear a little voice in your brain that says, I'm worthless. You're only saying you love me because you think you have to. Somehow from the mouths of other people to your ear, all words of blessing and encouragement get tumbled upside down and backwards and confirm your suspicions about yourself, right? That you're an abject failure, right? That you're unloved, unlovable, and everybody knows it. There are hundreds of variations. You look nice today. Push it through the filter of depression and you get, not true, I know I'm ugly. Right? Or you seem to be feeling a little better today, and this means, oh, you don't want to talk to me anymore. This is your brain on depression. Right? Here's what somebody else from our community shared with me. Right? In the most intense parts of depression for me, I felt like I was in a deep, pitch black pit. No light, no way out, no sense of what was around me, no sense of time, and that maddening feeling like I'm in a non-existing sort of state. And all I have in those times are my thoughts and the many negative, condemning voices, right? A constant background of static going on in my head. I came to believe that all these voices were just telling me what everyone else knows to be true, or what they would know to be true about me if they could see the real me. Right? It's this filter that just affects everything you process and everything that you hear. Right? So like last week, Eric Smith is speaking, and I'm standing right over there, right? And he says some very kind words, at the beginning. Says, I work with hundreds of pastors as part of my job, and just so you know, Mosaic, I mean it when I say you have one of the best. And you're all nice and applauded, and I'm sitting over there, and I just look down on the carpet, and in my brain, no lie, I'm just deflecting that, and I'm thinking, Eric, dude, you're doing what I do when I go guest speak. You're just saying that because you're building rapport with the audience. You don't mean it. They're clapping because they feel like they have to. You kind of put them on the spot, And that's just kind of the way it works. Everything gets put through this filter, and it shapes what you're thinking and what you're hearing. Another way, a third way, the last way that we'll talk about this morning is that mind reading, fortune telling, right? It's irrational, but you feel like you actually know people's motives, you know what they're thinking, it's typically about you, and it's not good. You know what I'm saying? And of course, it's irrational. It makes no sense, but when you're in that dark place, you do that oftentimes. Not everybody, but for some who struggle with this. I love this poem by Philip Lapoti that illustrates this idea in a really, what I think is a really funny way. First service didn't laugh, so we'll see what you think. But I thought it was pretty amazing. It's this kind of paranoid state. And this is a fictional letter. It's a poem, but being written from a group of friends to their friend. And this is what it says. We who are your closest friends feel the time has come to tell you that every Thursday we've been meeting as a group to devise ways to keep you in perpetual uncertainty, frustration, discontent, and torture by neither loving you as much as you want nor cutting you adrift. Your analyst is in on it, plus your boyfriend and your ex-husband. And we have pledged to disappoint you as long as you need us. In announcing our association, we realize that we've placed in your hands a possible antidote against uncertainty, indeed against ourselves. But since our Thursday nights have brought us to a community of purpose rare unto itself, with you as the natural center, we feel hopeful that you will continue to make unreasonable demands for our affection. If not as a consequence of your disastrous personality, then at least for the good of the collective. Oh, which I love. And I love it too because part of what he's pointing out is there is this irrational element to depression and anxiety. And for those of us who struggle with it, there is something very therapeutic about getting to the point and realizing and being able to laugh at yourself. You know? Really, because they're irrational. And oftentimes, we know they're irrational. Right? But when you get to that point where you can actually laugh with other people about it, it's very therapeutic. And this is, I love this. This is another thing shared by somebody in our community. And she said this, yesterday I heard the song All About That Bass. And I started crying. Because wow, what an inspiring self-image this woman has. 10 years ago, I would have processed my reaction as, what is wrong with me? Why can't I hold it together? But now I can just laugh at myself. You know, most people who have depression, anxiety will cycle through it many times in their lifetime. But you do get better at dealing with it, right? Which I love. So I want to talk just real briefly. We've talked about what it feels like and how it affects the way you feel, how it affects the way that you think, but also because it affects the way that you think and feel, it certainly affects what you do. First of all, simple things become very hard. Easy things. It can be very simple things like changing the oil on your car, you know, or getting the kids dressed into school, or preparing a meal, you know, or loading a dishwasher, which I recognize in marriage is not always a simple task. My wife has her own mental issues, OCD, but that's a different message for a different day. But simple things become very hard. They just do. This is what another person in our community shared with me. I can remember one of my first deep depressions. My mind was mush, and I could not think. If someone asked me what they could do to help, I had no idea. I couldn't think for myself. If someone had told me to go for a walk, it will make you feel better, that would have been laughable because I was lucky to walk to the bathroom. You know, Eric Smith, who spoke last week, he told me I could share this with you, but you know, a couple of years ago, he went through almost an entire year of very, very dark depression. And he had a dream that he's chasing after, and it just didn't pan out. And he spent the better part of a year in bed. And he would talk to people on the phone every now and then, or if he actually made it out, and they would say things like, hey, this didn't work. What's next for you? What's the next hill? What are your dreams? What are your goals? And he would just say, look, if I get out of bed tomorrow, that's a really good day. All right, a lot of us have been there. And when you're struggling with it, just seemingly easy things become very hard. One of the things that pictures I've used to describe like this season that I'm in right now is it feels like I'm in a fight or a race and I'm up to my waist in mud. You know, and it's just like every step just takes so much effort just to keep moving forward. And there are days when it feels like, you know, like I'm getting out of it, you know, like and I'm moving and I'm emerging from the swamp. But then there are days when it feels like I'm up to my neck in it and I can barely move. And this is often what people experience with depression and anxiety is these. And I will say this too, the issue, and this is important for you to understand, the issue is not that we don't know what to do. It's that we lack the strength to do it. Right? And so next week we're going to talk a little bit more about what those of us who struggle with depression and anxiety wish others understood and how you can love us well. But most of the time what we don't need is like 3 steps to victory or advice on how to get out of bed in the morning. We know. But it's that we lack the strength to do it oftentimes. A second thing that it affects the way that we do is oftentimes there's withdrawal and into isolation. You know, at this point, you're not reciprocating friendship.
You're constantly withdrawing to be by yourself, withdrawing into yourself, right? This is a big warning sign as you think about your friends and family, that so they're probably walking through depression when all of a sudden they just stop showing up. Right? They stop showing up for church, for small group. They start calling in sick to work. They're not returning phone calls and text messages. It's kind of like they've fallen off the face of the earth most of the time because that's exactly what they want to do. Right? And so even on Friday with our small group, a number of them here, and I shared with them, I was like, man, I've been panicking all day, and even an hour ago I was calculating like how I could just hide and run and be alone. And the thing is, again, like I know what I need and I know what I'm supposed to do. Right? These guys treat me with grace, and I knew it. And it was such a life-giving time, and it always is. Right? But when you're in that dark place, like you're no longer rationalizing. Right? It's irrational, but the panic is there, the fear is there, the desire to withdraw and be alone is still there. Again, it's not that we don't know what to do, it's just that we lack the strength to do it oftentimes. And this can be a biggie. And then lastly, another thing that it affects is oftentimes there's a loss of interest, right? And so there's this thing that you're so passionate about like 12 months ago, and then all of a sudden, you could care less. You know, your heart was 100% in, and you're ready to die on that hill, and then, you know, a number of months later, all of a sudden, like your heart's not in it. And this can be a big litmus test, to a good litmus test to whether or not you're actually walking through a season of depression right now. So here's the thing. There's a lot more we could say. I'm not going to. It's 12:15. But I would say this. Next week, we're going to talk more about the causes, cures, these different things. I'm sorry I went long, but here's the thing. I knew I was going to go long, and I just decided to go long, so I'm really not all that sorry I went long. But the reason I want to do this is I think in Christianity that oftentimes there's a tendency to treat things like mental health, mental illness, depression, anxiety specifically, very simplistically. And there's a tendency to treat it oftentimes in the Christian world simply spiritually. You know, and we will say things like, and this still gets said, that this is a spiritual problem. This is a spiritual problem. You have issues, right? If you could just get your character hammered out, if you could just come to really know God, to really trust God, to really love God, to really be a faithful person, then you would be healed of this. You wouldn't struggle. To which I say, BS. You know what I mean? That is such a load of crap. Right? Somebody just shared with me that they saw a sign outside a church that said, "Too blessed to be depressed." It is a good thing I did not see that sign. I would have been up in somebody's business. Right? But this is our tendency, is we really treat it simplistically, and we say that it is just a spiritual thing. And so let me just say this, and we'll talk more about it at length next week, but the conversation about mental health is relatively new to the church. And as we grow in understanding of the most complex organ in the human body, the mind, this conversation is going to continue to evolve and progress. And I think that should produce something in us as Christians. Right? The Bible talks about a number of people who struggled with depression, anxiety, bipolar, these different things. Right? But it talks about them descriptively, not prescriptively. Right? It describes the struggle, right? The wrestling, the heart-wrenching prayers, the suicidal thoughts at times. But it does not tell us exactly how we should think about it and how we should treat it and give us a whole blueprint for that. Right? And so for us as Christians, I think that has to produce in us a certain amount of grace and patience and humility when we talk about complex issues. And I know some of us, there's a certain allure to conservative fundamentalism, right, that makes very complex things very simplistic. Some of us, we just love us some black and white. But we dare not do this when it comes to mental health or depression, anxiety. We have to resist the urge to take a dogmatic approach into areas where the Bible does not take a dogmatic approach. We are learning, and we have a lot more yet to learn, and I think this has to produce in us grace and humility. And in the process, my prayer and my plea for us as a community is that we would come to be known by the one thing that Jesus says, I want my church to be known by this. And if you remember, by the way that we love one another. The way that we love one another through pain, through struggle, through darkness, through whatever, that should be our defining characteristic. And for those of you who do struggle with it, know that you are not alone. You are not alone. And one of the lies that you're going to be tempted to believe, that your enemy wants you to believe, is that you are very much alone in this. And to that I want to say, bah humbug. That is not true. Do not believe that for a second. That is a lie from the pit of hell. It's not true. Right, by the most conservative estimates I can find, at least 120 million people worldwide struggle with depression and anxiety. You are not alone. Right, godly men and women in this book, heroes of the faith, struggle with depression and anxiety. Just please pick it up. There's a whole book, Lamentations, all about hurting and lament. Right, a third of the Psalms are lament psalms. Right, I've got the pain down in my heart. They're crying out to God. Great men, Elijah, Jeremiah, Timothy, Jesus, struggled at times with anxiety, intense anxiety. You are not alone. Right? I'm one of them. And there are others in this room too. So don't believe that, and know that God is for you. And if you will let him, God will be with you. Right? That God desires to walk with you through the valley, to sit with you in the pit. Right? He will not abandon you. All right, just let these words of Jesus wash over you. I love this. And I am wrapping up. I know it's the longest outro ever. Matthew 11, verses 28 and 30. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Stupid allergies. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. All right, that's the kind of God that God is. He will not let you go. He waits for you. It's the same God who met Elijah in his depression and his suicidal thoughts with tender grace. If you'll turn to him, that's exactly what you'll get. That's exactly what I long for you, and I pray for you. Let me pray for you. Lord God, I thank you that when we open up your word, we do not find a hall of fame filled with men and women who did not struggle, who did not hurt, who never walked through darkness or doubted your goodness or despair of life. But instead, we find very human men and women who struggled with all those things, who doubted your goodness at times, and you saw fit to include that in our Holy Scriptures to show us the kind of God that you are, to show us that faith sometimes is very hard and full of uncertainty, but that you, in the midst of it, will not let us go, that you offer us rest, that you offer us life even when life seems so far out of reach. And that even when we aren't sure we want to go on, that you meet us in that place of despair with your tender grace. And Lord God, I pray for those in this room or listening in online, and that's exactly where they are. And Lord God, I ask that you meet them here, right where they are, at the bottom of the pit, at the depth of the valley. Give them a flicker of hope. Show them what you're like. Assure them that they are not alone and you're not going anywhere. for those of us who do not struggle with depression, anxiety, and those of us who do, Lord God, make us into your church you dreamed about, that is known first and foremost by the way that we love one another. That your church is a safe place, not for saints, but for sinners who you look at and you see Jesus. Make us into that, Lord. May it be so. So, Lord God, we come before you now as your people, as your church, and we pray these things in your name. Amen.